all standing together at either thing. And as far as I've been able to research, that was basically the high point of presidential gatherings for the entire 19th century. Why were presidential get-togethers so unusual back then, you ask? Well, based on what I have read and the presidential history buffs that I have spoken to, there are a few common theories. One was just that people died sooner in the old days, including presidents. If you look at this chart of presidential lifespans made by Robert Allison, you can see that apart from the Founding Fathers presidents, most presidents tended to die relatively soon after leaving office, meaning we didn't really see a lot of former presidents begin to pile up until the latter years of the 20th century. It is also the case that a lot of the 19th century presidents were pretty partisan in retirement, sometimes even seeking other political offices post-presidency. So a lot of the former presidents of those days would have likely regarded the other recent presidents as political enemies that they didn't respect, and it probably wouldn't have occurred to them to go out of their way to organize a friendly little get-together. But the biggest explanation is probably just that this whole idea of a former president as a specific flavor of political celebrity is a relatively modern cultural creation. According to this excellent book, The President's Club, authors Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy point out that it wasn't until the late 1950s that laws were made giving ex-presidents things like government pensions, office space, staff, and security, which in turn gave them a kind of permanent official status akin to something like, I don't know, national landmarks. And this was in contrast to the previous cultural norm that once you left the White House, you just went back to being a normal person and had to fend for yourself. But it wasn't just a one-way street. The post-war years also saw a rise in new presidential traditions involving things like inaugurations, funerals, and presidential library openings that ex-presidents were now expected to play a prominent role at. All right, so let us take a deep dive into this era. So we mentioned Chester A. Arthur's inauguration, and for a long time, presidential inaugurations were the only place where you would expect to see even two presidents together at the same time. And this was because it had been a tradition since the earliest days of the US for the outgoing president to attend the inauguration of the new one. Today, of course, it is common for earlier presidents to show up too, but that wasn't the case until fairly recently. After the Arthur inauguration, it wouldn't be until the 1929 swearing in of Herbert Hoover that we saw another instance of three presidents at an inauguration, as well as our first ever photograph of three living presidents together. So here we see President Hoover taking the oath of office, and over here is outgoing President Calvin Coolidge, looking as cheerful as ever. And administering the oath to Hoover is former President William Howard Taft, who, as we all know, became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court after leaving office. But maybe this isn't the best example, since Taft had to be there as part of his job. In 1932, Hoover was defeated in his bid for a second term by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and by the time Roosevelt was sworn in March of 1933, Taft and Coolidge were both dead, making Hoover the only living ex-president. Roosevelt then died in office in 1945 and was replaced by Harry S. Truman, who was president until 1953. And for all intents and purposes, 1953 was basically the year zero of our modern era of former presidents, because Hoover and Truman were not only the first ex-presidents to be incorporated into the new legal regime that gave special privileges to them, but they were also two former presidents who lived for quite a long time after leaving office and hung around Washington a lot. This gave them a lot of opportunities to do former president stuff. The book credits them as the founders of the President's Club. Hoover and Truman both attended the inauguration of President Dwight David Eisenhower in 1953, although we don't have a clear picture of both of them there. This is Truman here, and Hoover is the guy getting blocked out behind him. Here is a photo taken on November 10th, 1962, which was the funeral of Eleanor Roosevelt, Franklin's widow. By now, the president was John F. Kennedy, who we see here, and here is former President Truman, and then over here we have former President Eisenhower. Hoover, in theory, could have been there as well, but he was quite close to death himself and wasn't really going to things anymore. It is a striking picture, but it was also the last of its kind for a while. Truman and Eisenhower both went to JFK's funeral in 1963 after he was killed, but there are no photos of them with the new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. When the aging Herbert Hoover, in turn, died the next year in 1964, it was now Eisenhower and Truman who were too old to go to his funeral. And thus began a dark time for the American presidency. From 1963 to 1973, presidents were dying faster than new ones were coming to office, and this meant there were basically no opportunities for mass gatherings of ex-presidents. By the time that Richard Nixon was sworn in for his second term in January of 1973, he was literally the only living president of the United States. Former presidents Truman and Johnson had died immediately before and after. The years that followed were just the opposite, however. Starting with Nixon, a string of presidents came to power who all lived quite long lives and all spent at least 20 years as a former president. And it all culminated in a historic moment in 1981. In October of 81, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, was assassinated in a horrible massacre at a military parade, a deeply shocking terrorist attack. Egypt was considered a very close and important ally of the United States at that time, and it was agreed that the US should send an impressive delegation to Sadat's funeral. But fear of further terrorism prevented President Ronald Reagan from going, so it was decided that instead, America would send a delegation of all of the country's living former presidents: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and everyone's favorite, Jimmy Carter. Before they left for Egypt, all of the ex-presidents met with Reagan at the White House, which was treated as quite the big deal by the media. According to the Associated Press, it marked the first time in this century, and possibly ever, for 4 US presidents to get together. They added that the previous high had been 3 during those funerals we talked about earlier. This photo of the 4 men toasting in the Oval Office is a pretty famous symbol of the historic moment. Here is another famous photo, taken almost a decade later in 1990, at the opening of the official Richard Milhous Nixon Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. As we discussed in my video about the Nixon presidency, the opening of the Nixon Library was a carefully choreographed event designed to help revive Nixon's reputation and present him as a basically normal president, as opposed to a horribly disgraced one who had resigned from office amid enormous scandal. And one of the ways that the Nixon people hoped to stage manage their man's historic return to normalcy was by having all of America's living presidents attend the library's grand opening with him. But in the end, Nixon just had to settle for all of the living Republican presidents instead. Newly elected President George H.W. Bush, along with Ford, Reagan, and of course, Nixon himself. Jimmy Carter, who had been elected in large part as a repudiation of the Nixon presidency, did not show up, said to be sensitive to the optics of giving a symbolic endorsement to the cleaning up of Nixon's legacy. Nevertheless, the spectacle of the Nixon Library's opening was well received and helped establish a precedent that would be followed in subsequent decades. Just a year later, in fact, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was opened, and he was apparently uncontroversial enough that all 5 presidents were willing to come to that. An unprecedentedly large presidential gathering, but soon to be eclipsed. In 1993, Bill Clinton was sworn in as president, which briefly ushered in an era of 6 living presidents, the first time that number had been hit since a brief window during the Lincoln administration. But this time proved to be a brief window as well, as Richard Nixon died barely a year later in early 1994. He was given a big state funeral, and it marked the first and only time that the 5 living presidents of the 1990s were all together in the same place at the same time: Clinton, Bush, Reagan, Carter, and Ford. It was the only such gathering of these men, because later that same year, Ronald Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and stopped making any public appearances for the rest of his life. This was tragic for any number of reasons, but from our perspective, it meant that there could be no more gatherings of all the living presidents for a full decade until Reagan died in 2004. The opening of the George H.W. Bush Library in 1997, for instance, was kind of sad because it only had 4 of the 5 living presidents, which was commented on at the time. In 2001, George W. Bush came to power, and his inauguration was notable for being the first